Thank you, Suchimani. I've got some questions here. I want to say something about what it is I feel devoted to, how this came about, how I might consider it to be an insight practice, what it looks like in my life. And when I wrote those questions, I thought, that's the story of my life. The questions are quite clear, and the answers, at least my notes that are on the back of the questions, may not be quite so clear. I know that's not a good way of starting a talk. In fact, I'll just begin by following up two threads from the other night. Not all of you were there, but the other night when Mahamati, it was a lovely rejoicing really in Mahamati, and then that was me I felt like when I made an offering to the shrine, that was me becoming the order convener, one of the order conveners. And even though I've kind of been doing it for 4 months. But just in that act and in that evening, I was thinking to myself, and I've mentioned this to a couple of people afterwards, that means no one had talked to me about how long I might do it for. Like time frame has never been mentioned, not by Parami, not by Mahamati, not even by anybody asking me about taking it on. And that's quite convenient for me. But that just gives me a chance to say something about just kind of working my way into those questions, something about how I've approached my order life, because I very much feel that in taking on this order convening, it feels like I'll do it for just a term of office or something like that. And that is how I took on being chair of Padmaloka, which was one of my previous roles. And basically, that's how I've lived my sort of order life, is having a period where I feel I've been able to engage quite intensely in some sort of way for the order. And then I've had a period of doing something completely different. That's usually involved going off on my own. It's sometimes involved, the first time I did it was in 2005 when I'd stopped being the manager at Padmaloka, and I packed my rucksack and walked out the gate on the 10th of May and just walked around Britain for 5 months. I came back and got my bike at some point, and it felt really important. It felt fantastic. In fact, after those 5 months, I worked at Windhorse. I just pushed a trolley around the warehouse. Sorry, I don't mean to demean working for Windhorse in that way, but in other words, doing quite a simple job. And there was something about having a period of work where you have some responsibility and then letting it all go. So in this more recent period, I'd also been the chair of the India Dhamma Trust and probably some other things as well. I think I'd been working for Buddhafield East as well, and I pretty much stopped all of them, and I just wanted to be an order member without portfolio, as it were. And I feel that I'd like to do the same thing again, whatever happens. Hopefully I feel in good shape and I feel like I can do whatever is asked of me. At the moment I feel that. But after 3, 4, 5 years, I'd like to put down, whatever responsibilities that I've got and just be an ordinary order member. In fact, I'd like to wander about again. I've got a very strong nomadic myth in me, and if my body's up to it, I would literally like to walk the old ways, as Robert Macfarlane calls them. And the second thread from that other evening was I tried to tell a little story which I couldn't really contextualize, which was about picking up a hitchhiker who I much later sort of thought or worked out that it was probably an order member. And what I was trying to say there was that there was something about the way that person communicated to me, which I hadn't really encountered before. And you could put it down just to being sort of friendly and kind of curious and having a certain language about, I don't know, what it means to be a human being. But there was like a little bit of magic. I loved it when that word magic was used yesterday. And that's what I met when I walked through the door of the Norwich Buddhist Centre, whenever that was, November 96, I think. I think there's a few people here who might have been those early, in fact I can see one, Satchigita, who was Kerry then. There was also Savananda, there was also Satchapriya, there was Sujana, who was Dave then, one or two others. But anyway, the very early order members I met, within about 2 weeks I decided that this was what I was going to do with my life. I didn't know that we called it like Mitra, order member, all of that, I had no idea, but that was what I was going to do. And I'm still running on that momentum. Now that might sound, I don't know how that sounds actually, it might sound, I don't mean it to sound like a challenge, because I feel like it's my order life or my journey through our movement has been pretty straightforward. I mean, there's been a few collective bumps along the way, but it's been pretty straightforward, and I feel devoted. I feel devoted to the order. And that, I mean, there's lots about my life that feels quite complex, but I feel my devotion to the order feels pretty straightforward. And there was something about meeting those people who were doing something. I couldn't quite say what it was. I mean, now I can say, at the time it was, I didn't really have the language, but it was like meeting people who inhabited a world that had a bit of magic in it. So they were doing quite ordinary things. But how I came to see it, well, that's what I want to work my way into, really. It mainly comes around the idea of living with contradiction. That may not be how they described it themselves, but that was the question that I came into the Norwich Buddhist Centre with. I was just deeply aware of my own contradictions and deeply aware of the contradictions in the world. And if you like, meeting those people, and then it took a bit of time, but eventually coming across, Bante's presentation of the Bodhisattva ideal, and that was an aha moment for me. When I came across that, I was like, that is what I've been seeing. That is, and also it resolves the question that I've been carrying around with me for years about what it means to be a human and that kind of thing. So when I say contradiction, I mean, I'm not sure, that's just the word I've always used. It maybe I'm really talking about paradox, which is a slightly different term. But what I mean is where two or more directions, aspirations or desires are seemingly true and yet are in opposition or are incompatible. And, as Bante says, you can't resolve them on their own level. You need something else. You need to resolve them at a higher level. That has felt so deeply satisfying for me to come across that. I mean, you can relate it to all kinds of Buddhist teachings. I mean, even holding the inherent contradiction of samsara and nirvana, or form and emptiness. In my own life, I tend to see it in terms of inspiration and laziness, in two things going on simultaneously, probably right at this moment. There's also something about a desire for a quiet, renunciant life and the desire to serve something much greater than me. That one I can definitely feel right now going on. I thought maybe one way of just contextualising this a little bit for you, and maybe just gives you a bit of a sense of who I am, was just to tell you where the question came from for me, what the question that I brought into the Buddhist Centre. And some of you may know that I worked in the field of what I would broadly call international conflict resolution. And I'd been studying and working in that field for about 10 years up until this point. So that was from, say, the mid-80s to the mid-90s. And what I saw in that work is how groups of people struggle to find creative solutions to conflict, really. And how, and what happens when that goes wrong and people resort to violence or aggression and that kind of thing. And I also saw that what you might call structural or macro solutions were not enough, even though they could help. They were not enough. And eventually I came to see or think or intuit that you needed change that could happen in individual minds. Which is a very Dharmic way of looking at it. I didn't quite have the right language at the time, but that's really what I felt was needed. And that when this did happen, extraordinary things could happen collectively. So when change did happen in individuals. And I just wanted to give you, perhaps for me, my most inspiring example. And I haven't had a chance to meet Dharma Megha yet, but one of my areas of study was South African politics. And I'd spent some time there in 1992. And there were two events that really stayed with me, and they've stayed with me right now, up until this day. The second event was going to visit the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Cape Town in 1998, and just how inspiring that was. And that's just another story I haven't really got time to tell. But the first event, which was sort of connected to that, if you like, was in 1995. So a year after the elections in South Africa in which Nelson Mandela had become president. And in 1995, the specific incident for me was when Nelson Mandela handed the Rugby World Cup to Francois Pienaar, the South African captain. And the backstory, just very, very briefly, the backstory to that, as some of you may know or remember, South Africa had been frozen out of international sport for years because of apartheid. They were now back in that international arena. They were underdogs in the World Cup. They beat New Zealand in the final. Extraordinary. I mean, that was, that's a story in its own right. Not that relevant to today, but what was extraordinary, and I think I feel pretty confident I can make a strong dharmic link here, was Nelson Mandela standing up and giving this cup to Francois Pienaar, because he did it wearing the shirt of Francois Pienaar, the number 6 shirt. Now, that shirt for black South Africans represented the bigotry and oppression and fear and all the rest of it of apartheid that they'd been enduring for 50 plus years. And then what you have is this new president, a man of great dignity and integrity, who was able to wear the shirt of his oppressor. But now he's the president, and he's giving the cup to a white South African. And I found, in that moment, I thought, what is going on there? That is not just Nelson Mandela being a kind of savvy negotiator, it wasn't just a clever political gesture. I felt that he was doing something else. And again, I didn't really know what was going on. And it's taken Bante's clarity to help me understand what was going on in a way. That somehow, I think what he'd been able to do, Nelson Mandela this is unify his own contradictions, and in that way enable and help other people in his country to do the same. And I thought that was amazing. And even though South Africa's problems, of course, are not resolved, Dharma Megha will know that, it's not an easy country to live in. But I can tell you, as a forecaster of conflict, which was what my job was, he probably saved tens of thousands of lives by his personal example in the violence that could have happened in the political transition in that country. So that was the question that I went away with, if you like, of thinking what had been going on there. And I hope that's what, I don't want to claim Nelson Mandela as a bodhisattva, if you like, but it brought me on into the centre. And when I came across Bante's presentation of the Bodhisattva, it resolved something in me, and it also gave me something to which I deeply want to aspire to. So the first, I thought I would just give a few of the references. Most of them will know them, but just to kind of make the case, as it were. The first reference was in a survey of Buddhism, which I got hold of a copy of in probably 97. And just a couple of quotes from it. Bante says, the Bodhisattva ideal is the ripened fruit of the whole vast tree of Buddhism. Just as the fruit encloses the seed, so within the Bodhisattva ideal are recombined all the different and sometimes seemingly divergent elements of the Mahayana. And he describes the Mahayana as progressive, devotional, positive, not exclusively monastic, and above all, altruistic. And remember, that's Bante in 1955. And then later on, he quotes from this rather obscure text, the Ratnagotra Vibhaga, describing the Bodhisattva as one who, like a fire, his mind constantly blazes up into works for others, at the same time always remaining merged in the calm of the dhyanas and formless attainments. And that's it. Everything else in my life is footnotes to that quote, I think. That's what I feel I deeply aspire to. And I found that it also helped me to understand the kind of questions that I brought into. So I just wanted to stop there and say, in that quote, one thing that is striking is that although the Bodhisattva is someone continually working for the benefit of others, he's also a deep meditator. He's a deep contemplative. And so I don't want to put, like this morning, this devotional aspect, if you like, in any sort of opposition to a meditative approach. What it is, they both contain an antidote and an inspiration for the other, if you like. And I feel deeply drawn to both sides of that. In trying to think of this, of living out, trying to live out that ideal, if you like, as an insight practice. So I think what I've done, fairly early on, I've imbibed that into the kind of substructure of my personality, and I just go around trying to live out that, trying to live with all the kind of contradictions that are within me. And for some reason, I sort of think of it in terms of the 4 postures of walking, lying, sitting, standing. That's what I do, just as I go about my daily life. So I do conceptualize it, I do think about it, I reflect on it, and it's going on somewhere beneath the surface as well, continually. And it feels deeply satisfying. When I say deeply satisfying, I'm still full of contradictions, but even that feels deeply satisfying that I can relate them to an ideal that somehow is connected to unification and resolution, if you like. I wanted to give another quote as well, because later on, in most of us, not Dharma Mega, have done the Mitra study course. And the second is from the Bodhisattva Ideal, where Bhante says that, this is the sort of main place, I think, that he talks about the Bodhisattva as a living contradiction, a living union of opposites at the highest possible level, in that he or she represents a synthesis of nirvana and samsara. And this synthesis cannot be expressed conceptually. And I think that, when I say that I try and go about my life trying to live this out, that's what I mean, that it's not just a conceptual practice. It's something that I feel can just go on and have its own working out. I wanted to say a little bit about sadhana, but just before that, I want to just for the sake of completion, my favourite Dharma book of Bhante's is still A Guide to the Buddha's Path, and in there he kind of takes this idea of the Bodhisattva as a living contradiction back to the Buddha, and he describes the twin miracle, which he says, he's quoting from the Mahavastu, when he says, "Then the Exalted One, standing in the air at the height of a palm tree, performed various and diverse miracles of double appearance. The lower part of his body would be in flames, while the upper part there streamed 500 jets of cold water. While the upper part of his body was in flames, 500 jets of cold water streamed from the lower part." And then it switches from side to side and so on. And Bhante just provides a beautiful little commentary on it, saying, "Fire and water represent between them all the cosmic opposites, heaven and earth, the masculine and the feminine, the conscious and the unconscious." Yeah, fantastic. So I feel when it was in 2002, Padma Vajra gave me the Avalokiteshvara sadhana, I feel that was connected to all of those quotes, to the Buddha, to the ideal of the Bodhisattva. The particular form, I took the 2-armed form, which, like Tara, has 1 foot stepping down, representing the altruistic works, and 1 foot in meditation posture, representing the contemplative meditator, if you like. And I feel I'm trying to live out that myth. It's as simple as that, really. So I wanted to say how I practice this, especially just relevant, becoming order convener, how I practice this in relation to the order, or how I see the order. Because although, I feel I have this archetype, if you like, it needs living out amongst people. And I do feel something, as though there's something within every order member that I can see of that. So when in starting this work just a few months ago, the first thing that struck me was a little bit of a difference between, I had been working for sort of a couple of years off and on. I started working with the ordination team at Padmaloka, the men's ordination team. And it was really interesting that I noticed in the work with the ordination team, you're kind of presenting an ideal. You're presenting an ideal, you're kind of laying out what a Sangha could be, what the Dharma life looks like. And it was interesting coming into order convening work, it's more like you're seeing what that ideal looks like when it actually gets lived out. And that is fascinating, and it could mean it's it looks a bit messier. And I mean that, and I don't mean to say that that's got a bit disappointing. I think that is incredibly important, that's what ideals look like. Ideals, you have an ideal, then you have your lived experience of it. And we inhabit the creative tension between the two. And that is, I think that this is our gift to the world. I really do. I think that's what I was seeing when I met those order members and those people training for ordination, first walking through the centre. It's so easy to underestimate that. But I think that is our gift to the world, that we inhabit this place where we're trying to do something, we're trying to live out an ideal, and we're aware of just how difficult that is and how complicated, messy it can look sometimes. We can go through periods of fear and doubt, maybe constantly. But that's what it looks like. And that is what the order is about. I sometimes think of it as having kind of one foot quite firmly planted in the world of samsara and, fears, desires, cravings, and one foot kind of delicately placed on the transcendental with all its beauty and magic and mystery and so on. Yeah. So I don't think I've got that much more to say. I've got loads more notes, but I think that I've probably said what I really wanted to say. Maybe, it'd be a shame to miss out Bhante. I know I haven't quoting from his works, but just him individually, he somehow, for me, occupies that middle ground between the order and the archetype. And, I can both see him as someone, he can be quite vulnerable at times in these periods over the last years when he's lost his sleep, and he's been quite open, I think, about how sort of fragile he's been. And at the same time, there's an immense strength in him as well that comes through his writing and those early seminars. Last year, when I was on the ordination course at Gokuloka, I read the Endlessly Fascinating Cry seminar. In fact, it's the very first one that happened, I think, in 1973. Again, that's a Norfolk reference. It happened in Titishall, I think, a little village in an old rectory. It's lovely reading through the list of people on it. Subhuti was there. In fact, Vajradhaka was there. He might be here today. Ashvajit, Gautami. And I got a sense of Bhante's strength somehow. That there he was in Norfolk talking about the Bodhicharya Avatara, being able to kind of translate it and make it relevant to people. And in the 300 pages of that seminar, you can still, even on the printed page, you get a sense of the force of his inspiration and so on. But also, he says himself, he is full of contradictions. I think he says somewhere that if it wasn't for the Dharma, they probably would have ripped him apart. It was only the Dharma that could provide that sort of unifying force or something like that. If you don't mind, I'm just going to pause for a moment, see if there's anything else I want to say. I'm not very good at endings, I'll just tell you that. Right now. Somewhere on the back, I did write down an ending. Let me just find that. I'll probably sit down and think, I wanted to say that as well. We just had the men's convention last week, and we used a bit of text from Milarepa. There, lovely bit of text. And Ratnagosha gave a talk on Dharmapriya on the last day, and there was using a little bit of text from the Shepherd's Search for Mind. And in there, Milarepa he uses such beautiful language. and he describes uses paradoxical language to describe the goal, and I feel. So every time I hear these words, I'm thinking, yep, this is what I've signed up for. So I'll just read those out. It's only 3 lines. It says, without arrival, he reaches the place of the Buddha. Without seeing, he visions the Dharmakaya. And without effort, he does all things naturally. I'll leave it there. Thank you.